Hi everyone, my name is Sierra Bine. I am a content editor at the Globe and Mail. I'm also the author of the Globe Climate newsletter, and I'm also pleased to be your host and moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the Globe and Mail headquarters is situated. That is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I hope you can also take a moment to feel gratitude for the land you're on today. The Globe is presenting today's event with support from IBM, and we're pleased to have a representative from IBM on our program today, along with other speakers who are here independently. My first guest is Phil DeLuna. Phil is a Governor General gold medal scientist, and his work is focused on developing disruptive technologies to decarbonize Canada. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. Just to get us started, I wanted to ask you, how clean is Canada's energy grid as it stands right now?
It's a good question. So we should baseline ourselves. Canada actually has a relatively clean electricity grid, much cleaner than many of our G7 colleagues and counterparts. Over 80% of Canada's electricity generation comes from non-emission or emitting sources of electricity. We have lots of hydroelectricity, especially in places like Quebec and Manitoba and British Columbia. And in places like in Ontario, we outphased coal many years ago and have a good, strong base of nuclear. So Canada, for the most part, is relatively green.
That's great to hear, but we're not quite at net zero. I think we're quite a bit of ways so far. But what is it that you think we need to be doing to get to net zero?
Yeah, of course. So that last little bit of percentages, that 18% or so, is really difficult. It's really hard to decarbonize electricity, and that's what we have to do first. When I talk about net zero, I always like to give my 5-point plan. Step one is to protect what we have. That's environmental protections, ensure that we're no longer taking or getting rid of grasslands and wetlands and natural carbon sinks, doing as much as we can to protect the natural carbon sources that we have. Step two is renewables everywhere. We have to tackle that last 18% of emitting sources of electricity and do so in a responsible way. Step three is electrify everything we possibly can. Whether that's electric vehicles for lightweight mobility transportation, or electric heat pumps in our homes, or just more efficient LED lighting, we can retrofit lots of our infrastructure to be more efficient and more electrified. Step four is to tackle hard to abate sectors which are impossible or difficult to electrify. That means steel, cement production, fertilizers, ammonia, flight, transportation that is heavy, shipping, trains, etc. We can do this, but we have to think of new technologies and new ways like hydrogen or carbon capture or bioenergy or biofuels to address these issues. And then finally, step five is to capture carbon from the atmosphere. It kind of makes sense. We got into this mess by taking carbon out from underground, extracting its energy value from it, and then allowing it to go into the atmosphere. So we have to take carbon out from the atmosphere and either stick it back underground or utilize it in ways that are net zero or net neutral in total. So that's my 5-point plan to get to net zero. We're almost there. We're at like 82% renewables today, or at least non-zero emitting fossil energy. But there's so much to be done and technology improvements to be done, especially for electrification, for decarbonizing our hard to abate sectors, and for capturing carbon from the atmosphere.
Thanks. 5 steps makes it sound easy, but I wanted to ask about energy sources and what energy sources that you consider to be clean.
Yeah, so this is a contentious topic, right? There's clean and then there's clean. And the reality is nothing is really 100% clean. And what I mean by that is even wind or solar has some sort of emissions footprint associated with it through the production of that. When you think of the life cycle, if you're going to build a big a wind turbine, you need concrete for the base. You have to extract the metal in order to build the massive wind turbine, etc. So there's kind of upfront emissions with the making and manufacture of these renewable sources. And then there's the operating emissions, and operating emissions for these things are very, very low compared to fossil fuels, for example. But for me, it's a very simple definition, and some may agree, some may not. But clean electricity is electricity that does not emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I consider nuclear to be part of that. And I know some folks will think that nuclear isn't clean. And from an environmental standpoint, yes, there's waste that we have to deal with. But if we're looking at it from the basis of emissions, I consider anything that doesn't produce emissions or put carbon into the atmosphere as clean electricity.
That's great. And just building on that, what clean energy technologies are you most excited about?
Yeah, so I think we should take a moment to think about Canada as a country and what strengths we have. So we are primarily a primary industry or tertiary industry economy. We have lots of natural resource extraction, and we have lots of financial services, banking, housing, etc. We don't have as much of that in between anymore, that manufacturing, those goods, etc. And really, what Canada has to bring to the energy transition is we have the natural resources that underpin this transition to a net zero economy. We need critical minerals for our batteries and for our electric vehicles and for our catalysts that will allow us to produce hydrogen. We need the steel and the green steel and the hydro and all these clean electricity in order to fuel that transition going forward. So when I think about what are the clean energy technologies that really excite me for Canada specifically, I can think of two, or really three, which is electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries, because as I said, we have not only do we have the raw materials, the cobalt, the nickel, the iron to build electric vehicle batteries, but we also have in Southwestern Ontario, for example, the manufacturing base in the automotive sector. And what we need to do is actually think about recycling, and there's lots of interesting technologies and companies that are coming out to recycle batteries at their end of life. So Canada can really own the podium in the life cycle of electric vehicles and critical minerals for battery storage. The second area where Canada can own is hydrogen. We have an abundance of natural gas in Alberta, which when you convert that into hydrogen coupled with carbon capture creates what people call blue hydrogen, but it's essentially hydrogen which we can export to our friends in our economies internationally like Japan and Germany who have lots of need for it. At the same time, places like Quebec and Manitoba with abundance of hydroelectricity can make hydrogen from water and renewables. So Canada, whether you're making it blue or green, can be a powerhouse in hydrogen production and export. And then finally, Canada has a massive advantage, a first mover advantage in carbon capture, whether that's point source carbon capture in Alberta and in places across the country, or whether that's direct air capture with companies like Carbon Engineering in British Columbia, or even utilization like Carbon Cure or other companies like that in Canada as well. So to sum up, it's long duration energy storage in the form of batteries, it's hydrogen and how Canada can win and export, and it's carbon capture, both point source and direct air, because we have the innovation that started here and we can capitalize it in the future.
Thank you so much, Phil. I'm just looking at the time, and I think that's all the time we have for now. But again, thank you so much for joining us today, Phil.
Thank you for having me. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. A few of my friends are on that panel, and it's going to be really great.
Awesome. Excited for you to listen in. And now let's bring on our panelists. First, we have John Bentley, a partner in enterprise strategy, energy and utilities with IBM Consulting. Next, we have Aaron Madrow, principal with Evoke Innovations. Also joining us is Kate Chisholm, Senior Vice President, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer with Capital Power. And last but not least, we have Chris Henderson, Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Let's jump right into the questions. Kate, I'm going to start with you. There's very clearly a growing sense of urgency around the need to develop clean energy sources. I wanted to ask what your views are on the pace of this progress to date and about the work we have ahead of us.
Well, I think I agree with Phil. Canada has actually made significant progress so far. We have developed technologies that we'll be able to export to other countries as well as applying internally. But the federal government has now come out with the fact that Since 2005, when Canada joined the Paris Accord, we've only reduced our net emissions by 9 megatons, or about 2% since 2005. That is in spite of making enormous emission reductions in certain of our sectors. It's just on a net basis. But of course, now that means that if we're going to make our new commitment to reduce our emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030, we're going to have to reduce our emissions by a further 38 or 43% in the next 8 years. 8 years is not long, especially in a country where regulatory approvals can take a very, very long time, and in a country in which investors are nervous to place capital that could be subject to policy change and could be stranded. And so we have a lot to do in 8 years, a lot. And so from my perspective, I think what we're doing is we're using existing technology to get us to where we need to go in 2030. And then beyond 2030, we're going to go into some of the things that Phil talked about. And by existing technology, for example, at Capital Power, we are converting our last coal units to natural gas. They'll be done by 2023, and that will reduce our emissions by about half, by about 3.5 megatons. And after that, we're going to attach at-source carbon capture and sequestration, which will reduce Alberta's emissions by another 3.5 tons. Those are very big numbers, and we'll have that done by 2027. If assuming the sun and the creek and the moon align, that is, we get permits on time, and the government ITC works out, and so on and so forth. After 2030, we're going to work on negative emissions, like Phil was talking about. We will be finished installing an experimental carbon capture unit to one of our natural gas stacks, and it will capture the carbon there and convert it into carbon nanotubes. Carbon nanotubes look like little black cake sprinkles, and they are completely inert, so they will never be released again. And we're hoping that we will be able to incorporate those carbon nanotubes into things like steel, aluminum, rubber tires, cement, things that are downstream, very, very, very large final emitters, to reduce their emissions, because these carbon nanotubes are stronger than steel, lighter than aluminum, and more conductive than copper. For example, you can do the same thing with aluminum, but with a half of the amount of aluminum. And so we're hoping to capture our own stack emissions and help the downstream emissions. And uber cool scientists working all over Canada, and especially in the energy industry, to reduce our emissions. And we're pretty proud of the progress we're making. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And just building off of that and the urgency, John, I wanted to ask you, because of everything that has been happening in Ukraine, we're seeing there's even more urgency than there was before around needing clean energy sources, and fast. Could you talk to us about that very quickly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the situation with the war in Ukraine is clearly terrible, and many might have thought that it would divert attention away from the net zero path that we're on in Europe. But actually, for the most part, it actually accelerates the need to shift to renewables and to do many of the things that have been discussed in Canada's journey. The motivations may be a bit different in terms of energy security, national independence, and affordability in the near term. But there's a massive investment program planned across Europe for a whole mix of technologies: offshore wind, hydrogen technologies, and yes, there will be in the short term perhaps some reversion to fossil fuels, which means that we'll have to accelerate to compensate. And then finally, I guess that there is a bit of a nuclear renaissance in Europe, so we'll see that form of clean fuel, clean electricity, as Phil was talking about.
Thank you. And Aaron, Evoke Innovations is a fund that supports early stage companies in clean energy and technology. And while from this conversation we know that clean energy isn't new, but it's been taking a while to gain some traction. Do you see that starting to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the world we're in today, the pace of interest in technology development is unprecedented. We've never seen so many dollars focused on climate tech and clean tech, and so many proponents standing behind it and willing to do pilots, to partner, to collaborate, and it's really quite amazing. I think we've never seen anything like it before. That said, these are really challenging technologies to develop and to commercialize, and it does take 10 to 15 years to go from the lab to a prototype to a demonstration project to something that can be commercialized, and requires a lot of capital to do that. And I think, in the past, the risk of doing that wasn't always favored, and the technical risks and the financial risks of investing in those types of technologies was challenging. But we're seeing the likes of Capital Power and other industrial players that are stepping up to the challenge, recognizing that, the shorter term technical risks and challenges are not as significant as the longer term challenges and risks that climate change presents. And so I do think we're seeing a lot of momentum and willingness to partner with earlier stage companies to progress technology a lot more quickly.
Thank you. And Chris, you represent Indigenous interests in the clean energy space. Could you tell us about the role of Indigenous communities in clean energy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. A little known fact is that Indigenous communities in Canada already own, co-own, or have a defined financial interest with 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure, most of that renewables. So they're also already the second largest asset holder of clean energy assets in the country. And therefore, they are a major player in what goes forward. And in that regard, where I come from is that I think we have to change the ownership and the management and leadership of energy futures. We can't do it the way we used to do it, which we would hold that was a bit of a colonial enterprise centrally controlled by corporations and governments. We need an energy democracy. We're not going to get to energy transition without having broader ownership, broader participation, and more change agents. So there are more new economy participants, which in our view is the fuel of accelerating change. And what that does is that unleashes the power of people, communities, capital, and ingenuity. So effectively, where Indigenous communities are coming from is that they're already leading the charge here in Canada. They own 10 times the amount of clean energy assets as all Canadian municipalities put together. Well, therefore, we think this is an indication that when you democratize energy, when people own energy locally and they are part of the change process to a net zero future, we will get there sooner.
Thank you. And I know we'll be talking more about this later in our discussions. Right now, I wanted to move on to talk about strategies and to, strategies to get to where we're talking about going. Kate, I'm going to throw it back to you. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but, Capital Power is an energy utility. You're based in Alberta, a province that is aiming to phase out coal-fired and electricity by next year. What approaches is Capital Power using to decarbonize?
Well, Capital Power, I agree with all of my fellow panelists. First of all, we are building renewables right, left, and center. We have wind farms and solar farms under development all over North America and Canada and the US. And so we believe strongly that, as Phil said, and others have said on the panel, you have to proliferate renewables to the vastest extent that you possibly can. But there is a limit to that. And the limit to that can be illustrated by things like the terrible winter that Texas had in 2021, and the cold snaps that Alberta had in 2021 and 2020, and perils posed in BC by wildfires and heat periods in the summer in Quebec and Ontario. And what that means is, frankly, the wind doesn't blow on the coldest days or the hottest days. And of course, solar doesn't power at the moment during the evening when it's dark. And batteries, short duration batteries, that is up to 4 hours, can elongate the production from renewable generation, but they can't deal with, for example, a 3-week cold snap like Alberta encountered in 2021, in which of Alberta's plentiful 3,200 megawatts of renewables, only 8 megawatts were producing. And so what we need to do is get as many renewables as possible, producing as much as they possibly can, but we also need to be ready for the extreme weather events that are going to take renewables off the system. And to do that at the moment in places like Alberta, Texas, even BC at the moment, and Ontario, the only way that you can do that is with natural gas. And so we're trying very, very hard to decarbonize natural gas. And I think we're getting there. I think we will be net zero by 2050, certainly, possibly 2040 or 2035, the way that we're working. And then we will have a net zero grid that is safe and reliable so that hospitals don't lose their power, but also affordable so that there's no consumer rate shock and net zero. So we think that's the way to go. Thank you.
I think it's interesting, you're talking about these kind of weather events, but are also driven by climate change that are affecting the way that we can even get our energy. So all the more reason to accelerate all of this. Kate, just going back to you for a second, I was curious to know if you could share a couple examples of clean energy projects that are underway at Capital Power.
Sure. I mentioned a moment ago what we call our Genesee Carbon Conversion Center, which is the unit that will take carbon emitted by our Genesee 3 unit, which will have been converted to gas from coal and convert it to carbon nanotubes. We're working with a company called C2CNT that would be able to develop that technology and turn it into direct air capture. As Phil DeLuna mentioned, we've come far enough that we are no longer going to be able to turn the climate dial without removing carbon from the atmosphere. We can no longer just avoid emitting it further. And so we are going to need to develop negative emissions technologies, and direct air capture is one that Capital Power is working very hard on.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this idea of being able to capture carbon and the negative emissions is something that a lot of Canadians don't hear about very often. So I love that we're able to explore that more here. Aaron, I'm turning to you because we hear a lot that governments can't do this alone. As much as we love talking about policy and all the things that plans we have ahead, but we do need private sector capital and just all sorts of financing to scale up clean energy. What barriers have been holding businesses back? And maybe we could talk about some of the challenges what would help overcome these challenges.
Sure. Maybe just a quick comment too on the role of public funding versus private funding. Often we see early stage companies benefiting significantly from what we call non-dilutive funding very early in the development of their technology. And so this is in the form of grants and government programs that really support early capital for these companies to get off the ground and get running and sort of demonstrate a proof of concept and maybe get to a prototype. And so that's a stage that private funding would likely not participate in, or very rarely would participate in, because it's so risky. And so public funding plays a really strong role in enabling a lot of early technologies. But once it gets to a point in time where it's clear that the science works and that there is a path forward towards commercialization, the dollars proportionally get larger as well. And the idea is to de-risk the technology as you scale up, and that blend of public and private funding is a really great way to go. So venture capital plays a role in providing equity, high risk equity in early stages of technology development, often often in partnership with public funding as well. We sometimes do dollar matching and those types of things to help these companies get through those early stage milestones. And the idea is to get them to a point where they're at a pilot stage or a demonstration phase. And that is often where we see strategics, like corporate partners, for example, coming in and being a host at a site, for example, as Capital Power was with Genesee. And that's sort of an opportunity where the company can sort of show and work through some of the challenges and the technical scale-up issues that are faced when you get to an industrial level scale. The idea is that from there's a huge leap, usually to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars in engineering and construction and so on to get to commercial. And that's where, that certainly is where private investors play a significant role in enabling that investment opportunity. It should be fairly de-risked by that point in time. There certainly still is some risk in scaling to that level. And the hope is that, we can continue to see that traction. But to be clear, there needs to be an economic case at that point in time. The technology has to be viable. There has to be a pathway for market adoption and profitability. And if that's not there, the technology will not succeed. And so the idea is that you continue to de-risk the project as you go, but ultimately need the economics to make it work. The policy side is interesting there because things like carbon tax and investment tax credits can support the economics of these projects. Things like the Clean Fuel Standard also play a fairly strong role in enabling economics in some of these clean technologies that wouldn't have existed before. So I think throughout the entire life cycle of these developments, policy plays a very strong role, both in providing early stage funding, but also creating the economic conditions for these technologies to thrive in the market at the end of the day and enable private capital to come in.
I feel like what I'm hearing in all of this is we're going to need a lot of collaboration going forward as well. John, taking a look at the bigger picture in all of this, we are talking about like massive scale for clean energy development. Could you maybe explore some of the considerations that go hand in hand with that, maybe related to, supply chain and labor or any other aspects that are going to be involved?
Well, I think you're exactly right. Collaboration is going to be key, and different types of collaboration that we've had before. So I'd kind of pick three areas to look at. One that we haven't talked about so far on the panel is the complexity that this world of renewables, this different world of energy, creates for system management. Chris talked about what I call the democratization of energy, the local ownership. But that's not just in terms of the generation; it's also in terms of the demand. So how do we harness the flexibility in people's behavior and the use of energy at different times, different sources, to enable us to balance the system, in the face of renewables. As Kate said, when we have 3 weeks of extreme weather, it's a different situation. But actually, renewables are volatile and to a degree uncertain all the time. So the first, I think, area for collaboration is to harness the demand side into the management of the systems. And we're working with a consortium of European TSOs called Equigi in Europe to harness the electric vehicles and the charge points that are operated by completely different companies to make that available for system balancing. We're doing something similar in the Nordics to harness the flexibility in the built environment, so HVAC systems and so on, and certain industrial processes. The second area, I think, is in this kind of difficult to abate sector. So it's been really interesting to see some very unusual partnerships emerge in Europe recently. One that I'd pick, Iberdrola and a company called H2 Green Steel, with an agreement by Mercedes-Benz to buy the steel that these green plants produce from renewables to hydrogen, such that by 2025 their intent is all the steel will be produced from green plants that's generated from ultimately from electrons, and that's bringing together companies that don't naturally operate in the same sectors. They're not regulated by the same same companies. And then the third, you mentioned supply chain. I mean, the build out of infrastructure across Europe is going to be huge over the next 5 to 10 years, and it's creating massive contention for the same commodities, the same semi-finished goods, at a time where we have very disrupted supply chains, and we've got some geopolitical risk at the top end of the supply chain. So I think huge amounts of collaboration is possible, collaborative planning, collaborative logistics, in order to best ensure that these projects don't end up being delayed by supply chain issues. And from an IBM perspective, we see it's not a silver bullet, but we see technology as a big enabler to that collaboration.
For sure, and I'm sure the pandemic did not help with supply chain issues at all. Chris, I wanted to turn to you again to ask about clean energy projects in Indigenous communities. And as John mentioned, the democratization of energy is something that you've talked about before. Could you explain a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to see Aaron made a reference that part of this is a policy paradigm. And I always find it funny that when we talk about energy transition, it seems to be a slow incremental process of change, almost a snail's pace. And in some ways, while there's changes occurring, it's moving way too slow for where we need to get to. And therefore, I think it's time to break some China. We need new rules, new systems. I mean, we're basically operating energy in the world with the regulations, management, policy, and investment terms of the 20th century, and we're now in the 21st century. And so then from an Indigenous community standpoint, they've been very active with renewable energy. The largest wind farm in the country is owned by an Indigenous community and their partners, the Henvey Inlet First Nation on the shores of James Bay. The largest solar farms in the country are co-owned with First Nations. I'm involved with a project in northern Quebec and the Arctic on shores of Hudson's Bay that is replacing all the diesel in the community of Inukjuak 100% with clean hydropower. And this is the kind of projects that renewable energy communities have been involved with. But that's also been possible because change has been occurring. But now we need another set of change to go to the next wave of clean energy. And that's getting into some of the issues that John's mentioned in terms of the demand side management. Things like high intensive energy efficiency is getting into the technology issues that both Kate and Aaron have noted. And so from the standpoint of Indigenous communities, they've had a lot of ground truthing, on the ground experience to develop clean energy with partners, mostly renewable energy, hydro, wind, and solar. But that's with the rules of the game that have been in place. To really take the jump and really move to net zero, we're going to have to look at how the transition accelerates. And that just doesn't mean incrementality, that means a nexus change. And that will allow the issues to get into the electrification of the whole economy that Phil's noted. So Phil noted in Canada, for example, we've only got about just less than 20% to go to electrify, to make the electricity grid net zero. But then if you want to penetrate that into industry, into transport, well, it's a different game altogether. That cannot occur with the structures we have and not occur with the actors that of the past. But I do know Indigenous communities are ready to take that change as they have been for the last 2 decades.
Thanks. And staying with you for one moment on that, we've been talking about how these communities are large asset owners of clean energy. What do you think could speed up the clean energy projects in these communities, since we are talking about acceleration?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to note. I mean, there are the remote communities, the northern communities in Canada that are trying to get off diesel. While they're a relatively small footprint in terms of carbon, they are a very large footprint in geography and very relevant to the sustainability of the country. So I think continuing to accelerate diesel reduction is very important with renewables and storage as it becomes more and more competitive. But I would also say that I think there are natural partnerships that were unexploited yet. I think there's a natural relationship between local Indigenous communities and utilities, with regulators and with governments, in how we plan the electrification of the future. Electrification planning has largely been done in Canada by utilities and central agencies, but we need to evolve that to be more of a civil society process. That will allow change to be unleashed. In addition, I think there are real questions about how the capitalization of change will occur. We need new models of capitalization, and that requires as how we're really shifting the whole economy. How can we do that? So what I would say is that I do see that there's a new forms of partnerships, new forms of relationship that we need to take further, particularly at the provincial and territorial level.
Thank you. And I'm just thinking about what you said earlier about, avoiding creating new sort of colonial relationships. And I think having an agency in that will be very important for Indigenous communities as well. Aaron, do you think businesses know enough about the opportunities in clean energy and the risk of not acting soon enough?
It's a great question. I think the knowledge base is increasing and it is growing, but it is all very new. So even as early as 2 years ago, I think it would be fair to say that most executives at a company did not know what things like carbon capture are, what the opportunities with hydrogen were, and electrification and the like. And I think in the last 2 years, the learning curve has accelerated substantially in terms of understanding different mechanisms to abate carbon, different ways of looking at the challenges. I think any company that has a net zero target has at least gone through the exercise of looking across their emissions profiles in the company and understanding where the emissions come from and what some of the key opportunities might be for abating those emissions. We're seeing some of the lower hanging fruit opportunities coming forward, and things like in the oil and gas industry, mitigating methane emissions is one of those opportunities. But as you move up what we call the abatement curve and get into more and more expensive solutions, many of those are still not economic today. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the context of carbon pricing and clean fuel standards and things like that will play in terms of enabling the economics to go forward on those. So I think there's an increasing learning of what those technologies could look like. Today, they're still largely uneconomic, and there's still a lot of work to be done to de-risk the financial aspects as well as the technical aspects. I think the appetite is growing, but there's still a massive gap. And today, I haven't seen a lot of willingness to really take the leap to jump into really exploring those technologies. They're still a bit nascent, and there's not a lot of certainty in moving forward on some of those. And so there's still a lot more work to be done. I think there is a willingness and a necessity that is being recognized that we have to do that. There's a sense of existentiality that if you don't, that you will be out of business, and therefore there is an increasing willing to do so. But there is a gap, I think, today between the ability to act and the knowledge of what to do in order to make an impact. So hopefully we'll see as time wears out, we have a lot of net zero targets out there. I think what will be really important is to see how companies come forward with plans to execute those, and plans that are credible, that align with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and that demonstrate legitimate reductions over time that are in alignment with a net zero aspiration.
And I'm going to throw this also to Kate. I want to ask you the same question. Do you, from your perspective, see that businesses can see the opportunities, and do you think they're weighing the risks of not acting?
I do think that companies understand the risks and the opportunities. The problem that we have, and this is one that Aaron is perhaps a little bit more well positioned to speak to, but companies in Canada, for example, we're TSX listed, still face sort of a conundrum, and that is that there's very short-termism in the stock markets, and so Capital Power and companies like it that understand well the risks and the opportunities are really taking a much bigger risk than a lot of people talk about, because there is still this demand to produce quarter over quarter over quarter financial improvements, and it's hard to make big capital investments, long-term investments that are going to take your capital out of the market completely for years and years without doing that. But if I may, Sierra, I just want to sort of jump back on something that Chris raised, and that is the demand side stuff. We're talking about electricity, And I talked about the fact that Canada's net emissions have only reduced by about 2% since 2005. That's notwithstanding that the emissions from Canada's electric industry have been reduced by 40%. We have picked a lot, if not all, of the low-hanging fruit. I mean, this is a very complex challenge we're facing. But the reason that the net emissions are such as they are is for two reasons. First of all, we keep inventing new uses for electricity. So, for example, 34% of the Internet of Things, the 5G Internet of Things right now, is just connected cars. And these are not zero emission vehicles. These are just, OnStar in a GM truck and stuff like that. And so those things keep growing. But a more important reason that Canadians need to understand is something called the bounce back effect. And so we keep getting relatively helpful policies, such as would subsidize a more efficient refrigerator or LED lights and so on. And I anticipate more policies coming out that would subsidize zero emission vehicles with the best of intentions. But Canadians, for example, bought more efficient fridges, but they didn't retire the old ones. They just put them in their fridges as beer, or in their garages as beer fridges. So we didn't reduce demand for electricity by the efficiency delta between the new fridge and the old fridge. We just added to demand by the demand of the new fridges. And Canadians, we can't do this on the supply side alone. Chris is absolutely right. John mentioned it too. I think we're in alignment here. The demand side has got to step up. Thank you.
Actually, I'll stick with you for a second, just in this demand conversation. What are your thoughts on, the role of reducing energy consumption? What can we do there?
Well, we need to be aware. I mean, I'm an old lady. I grew up in the 60s and 70s when every family had one car and we had no computers. I went around my kitchen the other day and counted the number of clocks in my kitchen, and it was like 8. I have 17 connected devices in my house alone, and there are only 2 people that live there. So we just need to be aware of what our actions are doing. Canadians always glom on to that high per capita emissions rate that Canada allegedly has. Well, of course we do. We are an enormous company, second largest in the world, with huge known reserves and natural resources, including rare earth minerals that are being consumed elsewhere in the world. With only 38 million people, that's smaller than the population of California. And so this huge natural resource rich country with a tiny itsy bitsy little population, of course our per capita emissions are huge. We have to stop measuring emissions where they are produced, and we have to start measuring emissions where they are consumed. And that's the only way to change behavior. Thank you, Sierra.
Thanks. I would love to hear from a few others. Maybe Erin, I see you nodding. Do you have something to say on that too?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kate. And just to emphasize even further, I think we as a society don't fully appreciate how much energy comes from fossil fuels today. And the idea of transitioning to a clean economy whereby we're not combusting fossil fuels for the most part, and we're translating a lot of that energy into electricity, increases demand substantially. And I think what people should understand is that as we move through energy transition and decarbonization, it's actually more energy intensive, more demand to get to that point than it is less. And yes, we do need to be thoughtful of demand management and managing loads and things like that. But ultimately, the demand for electricity across industries, across new technologies, electric vehicle adoption and the like is going to dramatically increase demand on electricity. So we need to be prepared for that transition. And I think if you look to our neighbors to the south, there's a lot of investment going towards transmission support and building out long duration energy storage and the like, and really a focus on electrification being the key linchpin for decarbonization. And I'll say that most of the technologies that I work with and that I see come through every day are really expecting there to be an abundance of low cost, low carbon available electrons to drive their technologies. And that's everything from direct air capture and hydrogen developments to very many other industrial electrification approaches. And so I think we need to be prepared for that, that it is significantly more, not less.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to throw back to John really quickly. We were talking earlier about the need to deal with energy use in the industry. What approaches are you seeing in other nations that are showing success there?
So I think there's a base focus on energy efficiency. Certainly in the countries that I work in, there are a few of our clients haven't run some form of energy efficiency, energy optimization exercise. What I think we're beginning to see is more active involvement in that decarbonisation. So, the deployment of renewables onto their own estate, onto their own roofs, the enrollment of their available flexibility into schemes to harness that, and by the way, to monetize it for them. I mean, it's not a zero sum for them. And then I mentioned earlier the partnerships that seek to tie decarbonized energy sources to particular businesses. I guess are the three that we're seeing. I'm aligned with the comments that both Kate and Erin have made. I mean, we're going to see a massive increase in demand for electricity. And I don't think there are any really reliable estimates as to how big that increase is going to be when we start using hydrogen to decarbonize agricultural fertilizers, when we start thinking about how we're going to use synthetic fuels to decarbonize transportation. So, on the one hand, I think the carbon capture technologies that Kate talked about are a critical part of the journey. But on the second side, I think for me, the acceleration of the production of renewables and the investment in the next generation of energy system that allows us to embrace participation from demand, both at the consumer level but also at the industrial level, I think dwarf the challenge of energy efficiency. Looking at what's happening in Europe, you could kind of sum it up by we need to do twice as much as we thought we need to do, 3 times as fast, and that's essentially what's behind the Repower EU announcements earlier this week. An absolutely massive increase in the investment in renewable production. I think longer term, the appreciation that we're going to see for energy issues will percolate to some changes in behaviour, and those might be driven by purpose and belief, or they might be driven by hard economics in the home. But I think we will see some changes. We're already beginning to see more of a demand for circular economy from particularly from younger generations. So I think we're on the cusp of change in that respect as well.
For sure. And we're back to this word of acceleration. Let's talk a bit more about that and the next steps that we do need to take to make this acceleration happen. Chris, I'm going to turn to you to talk about financing the transition and the need to accelerate that. What are your views on the importance of financing this, and maybe like what options are out there?
Yeah, I think show me the money is a kind of important phrase in all this. I'd put 3 things on the table. If we're going to electrify the economy, what does the consumer or industry pay for electricity? And we have this really perverse situation across Canada and in fact globally to keep electricity prices low. In fact, in real terms, they're much lower than they were 2 decades ago and 3 decades ago and 4 decades ago. That doesn't make any sense, but that's the culture that's there. However, there's also the power of cumulative price rise. I put a simple situation on the table. If we increase the price of electricity by 1% a year for inflation for the next 20 or 30 years, we will then have a major source of revenue that will be able to fuel the transition of capitalization that we need. Secondly, on carbon pricing, including this country, we put carbon levies in, but then we've also said we'll give it back to people. And that's not a bad idea because it gets support for climate action. On the other hand, we haven't used some of that funding in a really major way for technology innovation and capital infrastructure. I think we need to do both. We need to give some of that money back from the carbon levy as it rises back to families and homes and businesses, but some of it should be used for entrepreneurs and for the infrastructure builders to build the economy of the future. If we don't do that, we're starving the change process. And finally, there is a role for government to write down risk of change of technology and risk of change of infrastructure, because when you build something new, you're hoping it will work, and there's risk associated with that. So I think public financing that write down risk effectively is crucial. And frankly, I think in large measure, governments have been avoiding that decision because it's a hard one to make, but I think we have to go there.
Thanks. And I'm going to stick with you, Chris, for one more second. I'd love if you could maybe talk about a few good examples of clean energy projects in Indigenous communities and maybe what led to their success.
Thanks. I'd love to do that. Let's look at Old Crow in the Yukon, which is a diesel reliant community where the fuel is flown in every 3 months to fuel the community. And they converted in partnership with ATCO, they converted in a large measure of that platform into solar and storage, which is working exceedingly well. And they're owners of that infrastructure, and ATCO is their partner in using that energy for local needs. Then you also get, large projects like Mesky-Udrasin, which is a wind project in Gaspé in Quebec, which is a partnership between the Mi'kmaq communities and Interjects. Those projects happen because three things occurred. One, there was partnerships at work, partnerships between Indigenous communities and private partners. Secondly, there was procurement regimes on the part of governments and the electricity infrastructure to buy that power. And finally, you really looked at how you delivered the performance of the project so benefits were realized. So if you want to take this forward, you really need to look at the right kinds of partnerships, the right kinds of procurement, and the right kinds of performance benefits so people say, I want to do more.
Definitely. I'm still hearing this word collaboration. I can tell it's going to be a big thing going forward. In the spirit of acceleration, I wanted to throw it quickly to you, Aaron. You know, is there a risk in moving maybe too quickly and building some reliances that, maybe within the supply chain or, just on other nations that might not be ideal moving forward?
Sure, Sierra. So yeah, I think we're in this challenging push and pull where there's this need to move as fast as we possibly can, deploy as quickly as we can, that 2050 is not that far around the corner. And then on the flip side, there is a risk in moving too quickly. And of course, there's a risk in moving too quickly and doing things wrong and making mistakes along the way that end up being expensive. But your point about energy security particularly comes to mind as we go through energy transition, and never more than recently have we been acutely aware of the need for energy security. Historically, energy security has certainly driven a lot of adoption of renewable energy and things like anaerobic digesters, where you could convert manure and other waste products into natural gas to be used, as well as things like rooftop solar and the like. And I think we're going to certainly see an acceleration of that type of demand in terms of bringing renewable technologies home and not relying on other nations, be it natural gas or other. However, I think we also have to be thoughtful of where a lot of the supply chain systems exist today and where those will go in the future. And part of the reason why solar panels are so cheap today is because of Chinese manufacturing that was able to derive economies of scale and really get the cost down. And today, China represents, the largest manufacturer of solar panels. Batteries are no different. The vast majority I would say, certainly in excess of 80%, if not more, of batteries are manufactured in China, and all of the processing steps associated with that as well. And so if we're going to be reliant on batteries, solar panels, et cetera, to drive energy transition in our economies, we need to be very thoughtful about who we're relying on for those supply chains. And I think Phil's comment about domesticating some of those opportunities, both in the sense of our extraction processes, but also manufacturing, is really important. And I think we're seeing that recognition, but I do think that is really key in terms of not just supporting energy transition, but doing it in a way that enables energy security in our nation as well.
Great. And I'm going to just throw to John and Kate this question. I wanted to talk about what are the best near-term opportunities in clean energy development that you're seeing. Maybe Kate, if you want to tackle that one first.
In my opinion, the biggest opportunities are that, as many others have mentioned already, there are a number of technologies that are technically viable and capable at scale, but are more expensive. Chris mentioned our focus on keeping electricity affordable, for example. And so, for example, Capital Power did its first carbon capture project in 2007. Our current one is actually our third one, major project. The other two were completely technically viable, but were pretty expensive, and so we didn't go ahead with them. And so what I think we need to do is break some China. Chris Henderson, here's to you.
John, do you have thoughts on
best
near-term opportunities?
There may be a bit of an echo. I mean, I think that it's interesting how much focus is spent on what we don't know how to do and technologies that are not yet ready for industrial scale, when we could focus much more on those that can be scaled and can be deployed. So, if you look at technologies like, let's take offshore wind, it's economic, it's deployable, and it's in probably the third or fourth iteration of or generation of innovation. So the turbines that are being deployed now are several orders of magnitude more powerful than those that were receiving a subsidy 10 years ago, when everybody said there's no way this technology will get to grid parity. So I think the first point is there's a bunch of technologies that are economic and can be deployed. So then we need to look at what are the impediments for those being deployed. And some of that's around certainty of schemes, some of it's around permitting, that's been mentioned before, some of it's around financing, and so on. Secondly, there are some technologies that are proven, but they're not yet economic at scale. They haven't yet had the advantage of the scale that we saw with batteries and solar panels, or what we've seen with renewables that benefited from encouragement in its early stages. And I think there we need to look at what are the interventions that enable those technologies to be deployed at scale. And then, sure, there are some technologies that we haven't yet developed, different forms of batteries. We've talked about direct air capture, some of the synthetic fuels. We just need to accelerate the research, the development, the testing, and that's the world that I think Erin described really, really well at the beginning of the panel.
Thanks. And just to help us wind down, I would love to ask everyone for one piece of advice that you would give to governments on this topic, on everything that we've talked about today. Chris, do you want to start maybe with one piece of advice?
Well, if we're going to break some China, let's build a new kitchen. And we have to realize if you're going to build a new kitchen, you're investing in the future. And that's going to require public leadership. And we can't avoid the challenges of that. We just have to go there. That's a conversation that we have to enter into.
Thanks. A kitchen that doesn't have 8 clocks in it. Am I right? Erin?
Yeah, my one comment would be, there is currently a pretty prolific gap between the level of ambition that we have as a nation, outlined by the ERP, the Emissions Reduction Plan, and the actual budget that we have to deliver on that. And I know we're in a challenging situation post-pandemic, debt levels and the rest of it, but really to accelerate the transition, we need to get capital moving forward, building that kitchen. We need to have strategic insight into what that future looks like, and we need to start building it. We also need to enable private capital to play in the market, and we need an ecosystem in which there's certainty around the policy, certainty around things like carbon taxes and investment tax credits and guarantees, because the investments that companies are making are 20, 30, 40, 50 year plus investments, and not having certainty on the economic viability is a non-starter. And so we need that to happen, and we need everyone to act in the system, and we need an efficient system that enables everyone to lean into their strengths to drive forward the change that we need.
Kate, a piece of advice?
Well, I agree completely with Aaron and Chris. What I would add is that the biggest impediment to us meeting our climate goals is actually a political one. It's not a technological one. And so if I had one piece of advice for governments and Canadians, I would say look beyond headlines and sound bites, because the application of critical thought, I think, would lead you inexorably to the conclusion that what we need is an all of the above solution. We all need to work together. We all have the same goal. And, the sound bites are things that can be printed in 144 characters or less, like let's get off fossil fuels, are not only oversimplistic, they're actually destructive to our common goal.
And John, one piece of advice before we
I'm going to break the rules and have two pieces of advice. The first one is to listen to what my fellow panelists said and act on it. And then the second, I think, is I think focusing on Europe just for a minute, but I think the same will be true in North America or more generally across the globe. We will need much more flows of energy and finance and technology between countries. So it's really important that the markets align and that we don't put impediments to prevent that. The developments of wind in the North Sea cross the jurisdictions of Norway, the UK, and the European Union. We're going to have offshore grids that enable the energy to flow to the different markets in those countries. It will only happen if there's collaboration between the countries and alignment of markets. And I would imagine the same is true when you start thinking about Canada exporting power to the US and so on.
Great, thank you guys. We're going to have to leave it there. But before we go, a big thank you again to all of you, Aaron, Chris, Kate, John, for joining us today. And a thank you also to Phil for speaking with us earlier. Of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for joining in our conversations. I would also like to quickly thank IBM for their support in today's event on behalf of the Globe, and a reminder that you will all receive a link to watch today's conversation in about 2 weeks. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a beautiful day. Bye now.